Hi everyone, welcome to the afternoon session for AMT. This is the last session, so the last day, sadly. There's been some great discussions that have happened in the previous panels that we've had. In this session, I have a guest speaker, Lucie Peart. First, before we start the session, I want to acknowledge the ancestors, elders and families of the lands on which we are all meeting from remotely today, and we have over the past few days. I thought it interesting that we should not only look at the research that's being done around regional media, but also include and have someone who is part of regional media right now, and that is Lucie Peart. Lucie is the managing editor of Gilgandra newspaper, Pty Ltd. Hopefully I got that right. And so I wanted to invite Lucie to give a bit of a case study of regional newspaper, how she's tackling this. I mean, there's lots of debate around how newspapers, particularly regional newspapers, are surviving in this digital environment that we have. So I want to invite Lucie, and I hope you enjoy Lucie as the guest for this session. Thanks, Lucie.
Thank you. So Gilgandra newspapers as a case study for the importance of regional media, presented by me, Lucie Peart, and I'm the managing editor of Gilgandra newspapers. Quick geography, Gilgandra newspapers and Gilgandra the town is about an hour north of Dubbo in New South Wales. So I'll just pick you through a bit about me. So how did I end up here? So I grew up in Canberra, and after finishing school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Didn't want to go to uni, so I ended up getting a job at Southern Cross Television in Watson, and I worked there in various departments. I started off in the traffic department before becoming a production assistant and a news technical director for a few years. In 2009, I decided to explore my mum's roots and see some of my family in the UK. So I packed up and headed off to London for the typical or not so typical gap year, because I'm a dual citizen. So I sort of had in my head that that was it. I was moving to London and who knows what was going to happen. But it wasn't great timing. So instead of working at Pinewood Studios and working on James Bond and having these outrageous dreams about what London was going to be, it was sort of the middle of the GFC and it was pretty hard to get a job. So I ended up doing a bit of cater waitering, worked a bit of television stuff here and there, but just travelled a lot. And then, total cliche, met my now husband at a birthday party, and that was it. We moved back to Australia when his visa ran out in 2010. So we moved back here to Gilgandra from London, and his family are farmers. So we lived here for a bit, and then we decided it wasn't happening for us at that time. So we moved to Brisbane for a couple of years. I did a bit of writing there. I did a bit more media, ad booking, that sort of stuff in Brisbane. And then we decided to come back to Gilgandra. I was back here for 2 weeks, and the current journalist at the time had quit and was moving to Darwin, I believe. And so the editor here, Marion Ferrier, offered me the job as journalist. No experience. I didn't really know her. She just took an absolute punt on me. And yeah, that was pretty much how I got the job. So after that, I just totally threw myself into it. I went to absolutely everything that was on, and I attended everything for work and really absorbed the nuances of the country life here. And I was never busier since then, pretty much. So in 2015, I had this conversation with Marion, the editor. She was looking at retiring. She was sort of umming and ahhing, going, I want to get out. No one wants to buy the paper. And I just sort of off the cuff said, I'd be interested. And she just right there and then shook my hand and said, I will sell it to you. So that's pretty much how I ended up with the paper. So in 2015, we went through the process of transferring the ownership, and we were at the time a part share with the then Fairfax Media, but when I took over we exited that partnership for the better. And I did that all while I was accompanying the Kiwi March, walking from Gilgandra to Sydney as their media liaison, so I was also pretty busy that year. So I took over the business in April 2016. And I guess personally it was a huge adjustment because I had gone from being the journalist, being, you know, a co-worker and a colleague, to the next day being the boss and the manager, and learning a lot of things other than just reading, you know, getting my normal weekly deadlines. I was now suddenly in charge of this everything else business, totally thrown in the deep end. That's really given me purpose and it's been really rewarding. So that's where we're at. Why newspapers? Newspapers are so much more than birth, deaths and marriages, and regional newspapers are often the only source of objective local news and issues in the town that they operate. Some places have community radio, but often the local newspaper is alone. As I said, so much more than birth, deaths and marriages, but although the passing of time and the people who are contributing to the social fabric of Gilgandra and communities like it are still very much a part of what regional newspapers do. A recent survey, which I believe was probably talked about yesterday in Alison's presentation, which was conducted by the Research Council, Deakin and RMIT universities in conjunction with Country Press Australia, it found that there's still a really strong demand for print in regional Australia, and that we are viewed as an essential service. And respondents also said that they preferred the local newspaper over their online sources and local government websites. And interestingly, people also feel they should have some input into the future of local news sustainability, and that they would be influenced at the polls by policies by parties in support of regional news media. Demographically, obviously no surprises here, newspapers are read mostly by older Australians. So people born some sort of between the 1950s to the 1990s, and our younger audiences tend towards a digital uptake. But overall, that survey found that readers are 2.6 times more likely to read the print edition than to read online. So that's pretty good news for us in the industry. So I'll just go through a bit about our business. Gilgandra Newspapers is a multifaceted business. We have an office in the main street of Gilgandra. There's roughly about 5 to 7 people normally working in the office. We print our own 2 publications for Gilgandra and our newer title, Nyngan. And we also currently print 3 other independents, Warren, Walgett and Wellington. And soon we'll be printing a 6th, which is a joint venture with myself, and I'll go into that a bit later, for Narromine. All those papers are under 1,000 circulation. We have a full-time printer who you'll see there, that's Phil. He's been working here for 35 years. We have a casual printer, graphics, journalist, a news editor who presented yesterday, Michael Thurlow, and a couple of administration roles and some other casual roles. We print in what I like to call our working museum. We have 2 Heidelberg printers, an MO and MOZ, both from the 1980s. One's a 2-colour printer and one's a 1-colour printer. We can collate and distribute from our print site in Gilgandra. And our 2-colour printer, along with some other machinery and our websites, were funded last year under the Small and Regional Publishers Innovation Fund. So we're a full commercial printer. We do all sorts of other print books, race books, calendars, and of course the newspapers. So this is our upgrade. So it was a bit of an issue. We had to take the whole door off the back of the building and front a crane everything in. So, and then move our whole print floor around. So luckily, because we're a bit quiet with COVID, we were able to do that last year without too much disruption. And this is our current print machinery there. So that second picture on your left there is our collator, which folds and collates our newspaper. And then there are a selection of our other printers. So I'll talk a bit about the websites, both funded. So we've got our news website there and our business directory, both launched last year and funded under the Innovation Grant. The news website at the moment is about 5,000, 6,000 views a month, and the business directory did have some really good views, but it's sort of dropped off the perch a bit, mainly just because we haven't been able to get out there and sell it so much during lockdown. So they're sort of some new challenges for us. And we'll talk quickly about the Gilgandra Weekly, our main publication. So we turned 110 in August this year. So we're back up to a solid 20 pages per week of content with a circulation around 800. We cover all aspects of life in Gilgandra, council, news, social scene, sport, schools, crime, you name it, we can cover it. Paper is put together by the news editor and one journalist, Emily Middleton, and they are assisted on production days by myself and our other journalists. We do all our own layup, graphic work, and our journalists write, edit and take photos and source all their own local content apart from contributions and political media releases, those sorts of things. Our print edition for Gilgandra is well supported by the town, and the news website is growing. It's just starting to sort of find its place. And we also have several regular contributors, and 2 sports reporters have been with us for nearly 40 years, taking photos and writing a column. So we do have a lot of diversity of voice in the paper. So our second publication, which we launched last year, is called the Ningen Weekly, and it's about to celebrate its first birthday next month. As you'd probably be aware, there's a large print closure of many Australian community media titles in 2020, which included the Ningen Observer. After a couple of months of no print edition and being inspired by a few other independents hearing about what they were doing, I rang the Ningen Council, and it was just really good timing because they were just starting and expressions of interest from local publishers to resume a print edition newspaper for the town. So we threw our hat in the ring, and they decided that what we do and what we could offer would be appropriate for Ningen, and so they backed us for their advertising spend that they would usually spend with the ACM title. So a couple of months later, we started publishing, and we did go over there sort of before we put our expression of interest in and canvass the businesses, my journalist and I, and we got some really good feedback, local business community groups. People just really wanted their newspaper back. So that really encouraged us. So we launched without an office, without a journalist. We sort of just cobbled it together from here. We were very ably helped by the Boganshire Council Community Engagement Officer. And then earlier this year, I found a young journalist and conned her, Talia, to move from Melbourne to Ningen permanently. And she's really taken over that patch and really grown that content there. So we started off 12 pages, we're now 16, and we've got a circulation around 350. So we're looking for a lot more growth in that market. But again, a baby and lockdown and all sorts of other things haven't really helped that. So that's our new publication. So I did this one on our own, but the next one I'm going to talk about, Narromine Star, is a joint venture. So that will be between myself, Gilgandra Newspapers, and our colleague in Dubbo at the Dubbo Photo News. So the owner of that, Tim Pankhurst, and I have been working on this probably for nearly 12 months. I believe the announcement about the Ningen Weekly being launch last year was run by our local ABC, and the next morning, 8:35 on the dot, I had a phone call from the Mayor of Narromine, and he said to me, "You're a busy woman, would you like to be busier?" And so he said, "We want a paper too." But at the time, I was sort of just trying to get Ningen going, so we didn't really think about it too much until a couple of months later. And so now we are preparing to launch that any day now, next month or in the beginning of November. We're going to have a sales role and a journalist working in Narromine. We're looking for around 800 to 1,000 copies weekly. The Shire have obviously been really important with that. And with the joint venture, we will print the paper here, and Tim's design team will do the design in Dubbo. So it just helps us with the logistics of adding that third title. And there's a lot going on in Narromine as well. They've got the Inland Rail, they've got a huge industrial estate off an aero park. So we're hoping that it will go really well, and we're very excited to get onto that, but we just had a little bit of trouble attracting staff, and the lockdown also didn't help. So I'll just chat now a little bit about, I guess, the industry as a broader perspective on what I see. Last year, I guess, had the potential to be doom and gloom, and at the beginning of 2020, that's kind of all we heard about, especially for local newspapers. But many towns have had either new publications pop up or, like what I've done, coming to a market left over from News Corp or ACM, and lots of other places have had ones shut down and reopen, and there's been a lot of movement in this space too. I guess Gilgandra newspapers, we're just one little one. That masthead you can see today says the Eyre Peninsula Advocate. They printed their first edition today. That's a new paper in South Australia, one of the Country Press members, in fact, the Country Press president. That's his new expansion there. So I got that this morning and was able to add it in. So I think it's a pretty exciting time for independent media in that regard. Obviously, you've had a huge revival in Queensland with the Today Print Group, and there's a lot of other little things popping up all the time. So you can learn about them with the Public Interest Journalism Initiative. They do a newsroom map of all the movements, and that's not just newspapers, that's all news media. So that's online, that's very interesting. And I guess last year I felt that all the independent papers suddenly became a bit more visible to, I guess, metro audiences. Suddenly thought, oh, all these papers are closing, and then where there was things opening or not closing, people sort of latched onto those stories, and you saw that sort of come through in the bigger media. So obviously what we do is not without its challenges. COVID, one of them, but ongoing, I guess, the decline in advertising over time is the most pertinent challenge, because obviously it's not free to do what we do. This is due in part to a decline in local ads and also a lack of advertising support from successive state and federal governments. They now sort of have this policy shift to online and this community alert style blended release of advertising that they release as information, and there's sort of this unspoken perception that publishers should be in a position to subsidise that sort of messaging. The landscape has changed. I mean, many publishers are doing what they can to pivot and capture that online generation, creating websites, that sort of things. The recent bargaining code legislated is actually now bringing big tech to the table. And publishers will essentially be compensated for the use of their copyright, and that's going to allow big tech to help small and regional newsrooms create new technical roles, different ways of publishing, and that'll help us navigate the digital era. Last year, as I said before, we launched our own website. It's not, I sort of call it the old news website, because we don't load all our content because we have a bit of a lag. and we want to protect our print editions, so we don't put everything up there for free. I've also found our local businesses obviously have embraced social media for their perceived better reach, and I guess ease of use for the advertiser. Sometimes I feel they forget a little bit that we're here employing local people, and that the print edition kind of sits around your household and is read by everyone in your house and can sit there for 2 or 3 weeks before it's recycled. But nevertheless, still ask you to turn up and take photos at the local sport or event, so they're still there. Another big challenge I find is attracting people to the country to come and work here. I have been really lucky recently to attract 2 young girls from Melbourne and Sydney to move to Gilgandra, but we do struggle to fill other roles such as design or print production, news editing. That's hard, especially when the boss is out on maternity leave all the time. So I'm a bit of a jack of all trades in the business, which isn't great because it doesn't leave me a lot of time to work on the business when I'm a little bit busy working in the business. But I have been very lucky also recently to employ a local news editor, Michael Thurlow, who presented about yesterday morning, and he's got an extensive background and knowledge in broadcasting and leadership, and he's really transformed our news flow with our journalists and our news production, and provided a bit of economy of scale, and that's allowed us to expand, bring a bit more of a modern approach to how we do business, expand our content, and put our pages up each week without, extra staff. As you may or may not have seen, we are about to begin a partnership with The Guardian. So we'll be hosting a University of Technology in Sydney graduate for 12 months in our newsroom. So she'll work for The Guardian 4 days, work for us 1 day, and sort of give her a bit of an understanding about what goes on in a country newsroom. And obviously that's got a benefit for The Guardian. They're wanting to expand their regional and rural coverage. But also creating this partnership with the uni is sort of addressing a bit of employment and attraction, so that, regional journalists can come out here and cut their teeth in the bush at small newspapers. So we're hoping that will be a bit of an ongoing thing that we could expand, I guess, to other universities or other technical schools, that sort of thing. Journalist cadet programs, that's another part of that problem. They were funded under the Innovation Fund, but when the Innovation Fund got canned and turned into the PING, we sort of lost that funding. It was just an extra incentive for journalists to come out to the bush, and a bit of relief for employers to know that they could take someone on for 12 months and find a spot for them in their business before having to take on that full financial burden of a new wage. So that's something we'd like to see return. For me in our business, printing is difficult. It's becoming harder to source commodities such as printing plates, newsprint for sheetfed machines and other printing parts, so much so that my printer has to drive 2 hours away and meet at a town with our print supplier out of the Central Coast tomorrow to pick up our printing plates that we need for the papers on Tuesday. So we've done that before a few times, and stock shortages mean we don't have enough time to get them delivered. So it's uneconomical for bigger printers such as News Corp and ACM to print papers like ours with circulations less than 1,000, because 1,000 copies are the spoils for their big printers. And obviously there's also a lot of logistical difficulties getting things out of Sydney. During lockdown the last 2 years has been really hard for people printing in Sydney and that are in the bush. There's also difficulties with staff again there. As I said before, our printer's been here for over 35 years, and if I have to replace him when he wants to retire, I'm not sure where I'm going to get a qualified printer that knows how to use machines from 1985. So that's going to be another big problem for me. And I guess our other challenge at the moment is legislation, such as the Voller case on defamation, makes publishers a bit vulnerable on social media, and that's particularly concerning when we're all being encouraged to sort of transform digitally and have this online presence, but then you could have this threat come from nowhere that could essentially bankrupt you because some keyboard warrior just wants to have their say. So that is quite concerning. Personally, as I mentioned before, there's many challenges for myself going from a journalist to a business owner, from a young woman and to a mother of 2 children under 3 and trying to balance everything. We can't always, with our resources, to provide the most extensive coverage of everything that's happened, as we just don't have the resources to do so all the time. And no doubt these are very challenging times for all traditional media, not just newspapers. So I wanted to also talk about the Country Press Associations. So I've been the president of Country Press New South Wales for 5 years, and as part of that, I also sit on the Country Press Australia board. Country Press New South Wales is in a state of growth after we lost the membership of the then Fairfax mastheads in 2016. So that was about 100 mastheads lost in our membership. But now we represent over 30 New South Wales independent mastheads. It's about 40,000 circulation weekly that we represent. And we're a place for networking support, and we do a lot of lobbying with government. And Country Press New South Wales is also looking at creating a long-term print solution for our members instead of trying to rely on the wider industry, because that, as we know, is becoming a little bit fraught. Earlier this year, ACM closed its printers in Sydney, so everyone had a mad scramble to go to another commercial entity, and that has had sort of up and down success for publishers. And Country Press Australia, which I guess is the national body of all the state bodies, represents about 130 mastheads, and it tackles the wider industries and digital transformation funding, fed government. They've lobbied for ACCC inquiries, the Innovation Fund, and they participate in another range of, lobbying and industry specialised things. They also have an advertising sales arm called Regional Media Connect. So the future. I'm actually really optimistic about the future of newspapers and I guess the wider traditional media landscape. I believe the Australian audience is searching for beacons of trust, I guess you could call us, in their communities, and that publishers are responding, and we're trying to transform for the 21st century. Even only 18 months ago, I would never have thought I would personally have the capacity within Gilgandra newspapers to expand our reach or have the opportunity to go to a new town and have a new publication. Obviously, because they were traditionally occupied by ACM and fairly big competition. As part of those closures, I do feel a real sense of loss for those communities that have lost their long-standing papers. Some of these papers are over 100 years old, and essentially they've lost access to their historical town record unless their librarian has kept very good records of their papers. Most of them have closed, they've moved online, they don't really get a lot of local updates, so they're sort of losing that local voice, local identity, and they're sick of being seen as just this bushy little town that other corporates just want to give them sort of national or more regional news, and that's not what they want. I know personally Gilgandra has a pretty strong future in print, and I know this because when we take 3 weeks off in December and January, people rock up on a Tuesday each week while we're not publishing to buy the paper. Sometimes they buy the last paper of the previous year twice or even 3 times and then come back and say, I've read that twice now. It happens every year. There's always a couple. And I believe, I guess, that I and myself and other newspaper colleagues are really just the current caretakers of these publications in a way, essentially, and I guess spiritually or, existentially, a local newspaper kind of belongs to its readers and the community that it serves. And I see it as our job to maintain that publication for future generations, but also keep that sort of ever watchful eye on the passage of time in regional Australia. And so I believe we'll still be here for a few years yet. And I guess the survey confirms that love for print in the bush, and there's so many reasons for that, but it's just such a tactile experience. And I really don't see people printing out photos of themselves from the website and sticking them on their fridge, yet people still cut out our newspaper and put their photos on their fridge. So I think we're here for a while, and I hope we are, and I'm very optimistic that we will be. So thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Also forgot to mention in the introduction that Lucy is technically on maternity leave.
Yes.
So I do want to thank you for coming back from your maternity leave, and I think it was it your mum is babysitting, or someone's
my husband's mother.
Yeah. So babysitting whilst you're doing this for us. So thank you to her also. I do want to open up with some questions. So if anyone has any, and you can put them into the chat. I was interested to see how you have already gone, or how you may go, with other media in the area. And are you sharing content, or are you trying to work with other media platforms?
Not so much. We have a local radio, community radio here, but at the moment they're not hugely active. And when they were a bit more active, we did sort of work together with them a bit more. But they're a volunteer organisation, and at the moment all of their volunteers would be classed in the vulnerable category, so they sort of haven't really been as active lately, and they don't obviously have capacity to employ journalists and those sorts of things. So when they're a bit more active, we do try and work with them a bit more. There are other media stations that sort of come into our patch from Dubbo that on and off we've had dealings with, and we deal a little bit with ABC Western Plains. They do a announcement of what's in the newspapers every day of the week, and they ring the different ones that are published that day, and so we go on and say, oh, today on the front page is this. So all the ones do that around in that area now. So that's been really good for us, because a lot of people actually listen to the radio at 7:30 in the morning, we found out. So that's sort of most of the collaboration. Obviously, when we start going at Narromine, that'll be a lot more collaboration between myself and Dubbo. But again, yeah, we don't, and The Guardian, obviously there'll be a bit of collab there. Our journalist here in Gilgandra has already written for the weekend edition once, and their journalist is yet to come out here because of the lockdown, but I think there'll be a bit more collaboration there as well.
Yeah. There's a big
thing there. I do have both the history by Rod Kirkpatrick. I do have that book, and I've also got Country Press New South Wales has got their own little book, 100-year book, but now they're 120 years old, so they probably need a little appendix update. But there's also another book called Country Conscience, which is also about country press. I do have all of those, and interestingly, when you read them, they tackle the same sort of things about state government advertising, and things have been going on for 100 years, so it's not a new problem to us.
Do you see the newspaper expanding into more of a multimedia platform than rather just a newspaper? Because we're seeing regional television move out of a number of areas, and that idea of local content changing. So could the newspaper be the central element where we're adding video content, audio content on an online platform, essentially?
Yeah, so it could be, and some of the people around us are sort of looking at those things. Our neighbour in Coonamble, Lee O'Connor at the Coonamble Times, runs now what is called the Western Plains app, and I guess that's something that is a bit more friendly to that sort of multimedia way of doing. Again, it's all about resources and how you pay for it, and Digital transformation, I guess, for us, we've gone to the website, to a business directory, but because they're all sort of funded under the grant, we haven't really pushed them to a spot where they are sustainable on themselves at this stage. But that is our goal for this year. But yeah, a lot of people are sort of looking at that, and there is some movement for country press in their negotiations with big tech about how those things will start to progress under that non-mandatory bargaining code.
Yeah, because we've seen a lot with journalists having to repurpose their content, so it's one story, but you're delivering it across multiple platforms. So I just wondered if that was where the future of regional media could go, that it fills that gap where we don't have the local TV station that we used to have. We don't necessarily have the local radio we used to, but it's, from what you've said in this presentation, local papers are really a heart within the community.
Yeah, that's how I feel. Obviously, I think if you're doing that sort of broader media, there probably would be an argument that then you're capturing, say, 99.5% of your total audience available to you, as opposed to just your one medium where you're probably about 70, 60%. But interestingly too, we had a presentation by Dr. Christy Hess at one of our country press meetings, and she was part of that survey. And one of the things that came out of that audience survey was that, newspaper editors should be looking at ways they can serve their current audience more, instead of sort of looking outwards and focusing on how to capture people that aren't engaged. So that was really interesting too. I guess that's about, doing your due diligence to the people that are supporting you today, and hoping that some of that will eventually capture the people of the future. But I think you're right, we all sort of have to move forward to this different way of operating, and there's different models out there, and there'll be different variations of success in that field.
I think what's important with what you've presented and your story in particular is, for many of us, we see all these papers that are essentially closing down. And the beauty of the story that you've just presented is, in fact, there is still a need for regional newspapers. And despite what's being said, you're actually growing your newspaper.
Yeah, I think the whole line about they're all dying and they're all dead is just complete rubbish. There's two companies that pulled out Dyer and Dead, and they're ACM and News Corp. There are hundreds of independent publishers in New South Wales alone. We can't capture all of them. Pretty much every town has something, whether that's a little village with an A4 flyer to a proper print newspaper like us, or I guess a news Facebook page, those sorts of things. If you actually dig into it, there are hundreds. And so it does annoy me when you do hear in the broader media, especially people like K Rudd saying, that Murdoch's taken over the whole world and there's nothing else other than, this one view, and maybe in a metro market that is the way, but in regional Australia, those sorts of statements just aren't true.
So we're starting to get a few questions coming up. Someone's asking, do you enjoy ongoing support from the local advertisers?
Yeah, we do. But again, it's a small pool of money. And then I guess the last little while has been really hard, because when your pub shuts, they sort of disappear for a little while as an advertiser. And then when they open, it's all sort of a bit weird as what's going on. And so we just sort of launched the business directory in the middle of the first lockdown last year as a bit of a thank you. And obviously grant funded, so that was easy for us to do. We do enjoy a lot of support locally, but I guess over the last few years, and it's sort of the way that social media works, I guess it's just easier for business owners to just post stuff on their own site. And to that extent, even community groups at their own events, you see all their stuff on Facebook, and they sort of, I guess, forget how easy it is to just email that content to the paper and it go in the paper, and they don't really have to do anything more. But over time, I guess I just feel like maybe your journalists have to just work a bit harder to try and recapture some of that would traditionally just people would think, oh, I need to put that in the paper, but now they just sort of put it out there online and then forget about it.
And it probably doesn't get to the right eyeballs anyway.
No, not in terms of an event or something. There's lots of times people ring us up and are going, oh, well, I saw something, somewhere. Like, they've got no idea. But if it's in the paper, it's still there on your kitchen table. So
How about how the papers cover Indigenous issues?
So we cover everything when we can, and when there's something to cover, I guess. When we possibly could do a bit more work in that area, we do have a land council office here, and in the past we have done a bit of work with them. We do have a strong Indigenous community in Gilgandra. So we could do a bit more work in that area, but again, they're part of the vulnerable group of community at the moment, and we don't. Our journalists can't really get out and about to visit everyone that we would usually do, and they're probably not doing very much at the moment either.
And again, COVID's a big issue here, but around community, does the community look for you to get information out, and are they looking to get it, free of charge, to publicise community events? How do you work with the community on those, what should be paid for and what you could potentially support?
So we've had a long-standing policy, I guess, which I just took from what was there previously. We have sort of come back on a few different things here and there, but yeah, obviously we have to pay for the paper, so we're not free for everything, but we do work with all our community groups, and over time, I guess we've probably supported all of them one way or another, with either free advertising or extra publicity and all those sorts of things. And we're open to those discussions, and we talk a lot to those groups. Gilgandra is such a thriving little metropolis. We have such a big council, but they also have extra businesses. We have a huge disability sector here. We've got Arana Living, which is all the housing and that sort of stuff, but they also have a jobs enterprise. So people with disability work at the local recycling plant and are very much members of the community. So again, that plays into COVID as how we're trying to protect our community. We also have a big aged care retirement village and two aged care lodges. And so, we do have those vulnerabilities, but they are generally really thriving and a lot of part of our coverage and a big part of the community.
And I think that sort of draws on another question that's here is, how do you define local stories, the local community?
Well, I guess it's sort of like our borders, really. Our shire, it's sort of, we're over 100 kilometres. We sort of try to stick to that hyper local. Obviously, when we get contributions from, say, we have our weekly columns from our local members and those sorts of things, some of that can be a bit further away. We do have a little bit of regional news, but we're not going to print stuff that you can get from your 24-hour media, from TV or your ABC radio. It's sort of not in our remit, and we don't need the content. There's enough going on without it, even when the businesses are shut. So we've just recently, under Michael's sort of repaneling of everything in our newsroom, gone from 16 pages to 20 in the middle of a lockdown. So that's just part of what we've decided to do, offer that extra content. And a lot of it is sort of readership engagement, I guess, cooking recipes, gardening tips, all that sorts of extra sort of stuff that we're doing now, but we're getting feedback that people are really loving that. So
yep. And I want to thank Michael, who's actually in the comments,
yeah,
and answering some of them for us. There's a question here around whether, if state government advertising was enforced again, how that would impact your paper.
It would be wonderful. I guess we just struggle as a group, Country Press New South Wales, and as independents, there are a lot of challenges in that space, and we know that not knowing who everyone is and everyone being represented by all sorts of different media companies is part of that problem. But also, I guess, the media release bombardment from not just government but private enterprise and non-profit and everything is full on, and it's really hard for us to get back those messages back to people. Like, this is an ad. If it's a service coming into our community, it's an ad. And I personally have seen so many NGOs or government services pull up their bus in the main street and stand there all day and talk to no one, because no one knows why they're here, because they haven't given us any notice, and they haven't really explained their purpose to the community. And so I guess for me, I see a huge gap there for government and NGO and whoever it is to really capitalise on our audiences and tell those stories properly, which would, help their service delivery. But it's very hard to get that message back to the heads of departments or the heads of the advertising agencies, and indeed the Premier. So there is a big challenge in that space for us.
And you mentioned a lot around local councils and the importance that they've played. Can you go into a bit more detail about how important the support of a local council is to establish a newspaper?
To establish and also to keep going. I mean, the government last year in the middle of the pandemic at the state level mandated that state governments don't have to, in New South Wales, don't have to advertise notices. So tenders, road closures, all of that can just go online. And obviously the survey found that no one looks at that. So to us, that's a bit counterproductive. Our council stayed with us, but I know there's other councils that rang up the next day and cancelled their advertising. And when you've got a big weekly advertiser, often your council is your biggest advertiser. They're also one of our ongoing print clients, but we have this understanding that we have a symbiotic relationship, so that if a journalist asks questions, we're not going to protect them from things if they're wrong, and vice versa. So they're very important. And I guess councils, the ones that we've been dealing with, Nyngan and Narromine, have both recognised that the local paper is a huge communication tool for them. And so they are also missing that as part of their message dynamic, and being quite supportive of us coming into that marketplace, and doing what we do, which is really easy. Turn up, write stories about the town, reflect what's going on, be hyper local, and just be there. It's really not rocket science, but a lot of the corporates sort of lost that way of doing business, and so that's why they all closed. And that's just a personal view. That's how I see it.
Yep. Just going to check if we have any final questions. I think we've covered them to a point. Someone mentioned around the importance of diversity. It's probably a point to talk about diversity in journalists, and actually having journalists come out to regional areas. And I think you touched on that about having student journalists come out and then hopefully them staying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone I've hired, well, I guess if we start with me, myself, I was a totally inexperienced day-to-day journalist. In fact, I was pretty inexperienced in writing and everything. And I just, funnily enough, just happened to be my calling, and I just didn't really know. But all the journalists I've hired have been graduates, rookies. And before that, we've had, before my time, it was mostly similar. They would come, they would either have done uni or not. They would do some training with the Deakin. Deakin Uni runs a course with Country Press Australia. It's a 3-year training course. I've done it. It's a great little course. Really enforces why we do what we do. And some of those journalists have gone on to bigger and better things from Gilgandra. Patrick Elliott is one of them. If anyone knows him, he's now working for Sydney Morning Herald. He started off, cut his teeth in Gilgandra. There's people here that have gone on to PR in different things like Taronga Zoo, and moved around all sorts of different papers. So yeah, I think it's really important, and it's such a good opportunity for young journalists, because you just come here and you have to do everything yourself, and you learn everything from turning up to interview someone to literally the paper being delivered to a petrol station to be bought, especially in our business. So I think that's part of why The Guardian chose to ask us to host their graduate journalists for the first part of that program, because they would get that more understanding of what we're doing. And I guess we're in a bit of expansion, so they probably thought it was going to be pretty exciting for them as well.
I think we're at the end. A lot of people saying thank you, and that's exactly what I wanted to say. Thank you, Lucie, for being part of AMT 2021, for taking the time. Again, thanks to your mother-in-law who's helping and assisting, and the baby stayed quiet.
Yeah, well, usually he's just here in the office with me, so
could have made a cameo. Thanks again. It's been a really interesting talk, and I think an important one that we need to look at in terms of regional media, and what you're doing with Gilgandra. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.